There is a road in Vermont that most people drive without thinking about it. Quarry Mill Road runs flat through the low fields of Addison County, the kind of road where nothing much has ever happened, and everyone expects that to continue. Farms sit behind their fences the way they always have. Seasons come in. Seasons go out. But that summer, cars started slowing down. First one truck. Then a van, with a city address on the door. Then men in clean boots, who had never needed to ask about soil. They all stopped at the same place. They all looked at the same field. A field full of red and purple flowers that everyone in town had already decided was a mistake. The woman who planted it had buried her husband 2 years before. She had no savings. No plan anyone could see. Only a farm the county had quietly written off. And a notebook no one knew existed. By the time the third summer came around, people in Millhaven had stopped pretending they were not paying attention. It started small, the way most things in a Vermont county town start. A pickup truck slowed on Quarry Mill Road one morning in early June, the driver leaning forward over his steering wheel to look across the fence at the field on the Holt property. He sat there long enough that the car behind him had to go around. Then he drove on, without stopping, but he came back the next day, and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, it was not just one truck. A white cargo van, with a Burlington address on the door, pulled into the gravel turnout near the mailbox, and sat for 20 minutes, while the woman in the passenger seat wrote something in a notebook. 2 men from an organic dairy operation 30 miles north stopped on their way back from the feed store, and stood outside their vehicle for a while, just looking, before one of them finally pulled out his phone and took a photograph. A buyer in a clean white truck, the kind that had never seen much mud, turned slowly into the driveway one Tuesday afternoon, and knocked on the farmhouse door. He did not come to talk about corn. He did not ask about hay yields, or equipment costs, or whether the back acreage was available for lease. He asked about the red clover. That was when the rest of the town really started paying attention, because for 3 years most of Millhaven had looked at Marilla Holt and seen a woman making a quiet and prolonged mistake. They saw a widow in her early 50s holding on to a farm that had already taken too much from her family. They saw tired soil and worn fields, and a woman who refused to admit that the reasonable thing, the sensible thing, was to sell. They saw a field full of pinkish-purple flowers, and thought she had simply let the place go. But Marilla Holt had not let anything go. She had been waiting. And by the time those trucks started lining up on Quarry Mill Road, what everyone had laughed at was the only crop in Addison County that seemed to be getting more valuable every single week. The question spreading through town was simple enough, though nobody wanted to be the one caught asking it out loud. What did Marilla Holt know about that field that the rest of them had missed? To understand that, you had to go back further than most people in Millhaven were willing to go. The Holt farm had been on that land for 3 generations. Marvy grew up there, as Marvella Crane, the only daughter of a man named Olin, who ran milk cows, and a woman who kept a large kitchen garden behind the house, and sold extra eggs from a cooler on the porch every Saturday morning. In those years, the land had a particular kind of life to it. After rain, the earthworms came up through the dark soil in numbers. The grass grew back thick after each cutting. The small creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property stayed clear through August. The low pasture held its green even in dry summers, when the neighboring farms went pale and brittle. But farms change, and they rarely change for the better all at once. The dairy cows were sold off when milk prices fell too far to make sense. The barn roof started leaking, and the repairs kept getting postponed. A few fields got rented out to a larger operation nearby that needed additional acreage for corn. Year after year, the same ground got pushed hard. Corn went in, and corn came out, and the field got worked, and sprayed and harvested, and worked again, season after season, until the soil that had once broken apart in dark crumbs started coming up in slabs. Nobody meant to ruin the land. That was the thing Marvy would say later, when people asked. Most farmers do not destroy their ground because they hate it. They do it because the bills arrive every month, and healthy soil requires more patience than most banks are willing to finance. By the time Marvy married Arvid Holt, and the two of them took over the property, the land still looked fine, from the road. In May it greened up the way Vermont fields always do. In September it sat peacefully under the low autumn light. But up close, the ground told a different story. The topsoil had thinned. Rainwater ran across the surface of the upper slope instead of soaking in. The lower field held water too long in spring, and cracked in dry spells by late summer. The middle section, the one people called the useless ground, because yields had been disappointing for years, had developed a hard layer just a few inches beneath the surface, that made a shovel bounce back when you tried to push it in. Arvid used to say the field had an attitude. Marvy never laughed at that. She knew the land was not stubborn. Arvid himself had said it plainest one evening, when they were sitting on the back porch, looking out over the fields at dusk. He said the land did not take from them. It had been taught to give, without being given anything in return, season after season, until it had nothing left to offer, and no way to say so. She had held on to that thought for years, without fully knowing why. When Arvid got sick, the farm became a kind of waiting. Medical bills came first. Soil tests waited. Fencing waited. Everything that could be delayed was delayed. After he died, the neighbors came around, with casseroles and sympathy cards, and quiet advice. Some of the advice was kind. Some of it was practical. And some of it was the kind of thing that sounds helpful right up, until you hear what is underneath it. You do not have to keep fighting this place, Marvy. You could lease the back 40, and still live in the house comfortably. Land prices are good right now. There is no shame in selling. Marvy thanked each of them, and kept the farm. Not because it was easy. Not because she had money she was not telling anyone about. And not because she believed that stubbornness alone could fix ground that had been worked nearly to death. She kept it because she had watched that land get treated like a machine for too many years, and somewhere in the long, quiet months of grief that followed Arvid's death, she decided she was done watching. She was not sure yet what she was going to do instead. That part came later, and it came from Arvid. 6 weeks after the funeral, on a cold November afternoon, when she was working through the old barn, moving things that had not been moved in years, and deciding what to keep and what to clear out, she found it. It was a small metal box, the kind used for keeping nails, or small tools, sitting on the back of a shelf behind a row of oil cans, that had not been touched in a long time. She almost moved it without opening it. But the box was heavier than she expected, and something shifted inside when she tilted it, so she pulled the latch and looked in. Inside was a notebook, with a brown cover, spiral-bound, the edges slightly bent, from being kept in a confined space. Arvid's handwriting on the first page. She sat down on an overturned milk crate right there in the barn, and opened it. The first several pages were familiar. Planting records. Equipment notes. Soil moisture observations, from a few different years, the kind of thing Arvid had always kept track of in various notebooks around the property. But at page 47, something changed. The handwriting got smaller, and more deliberate, and the dates in the top corners were, from 2 years, before Arvid died, from the period when he already knew what the doctors had told him, but had not yet told Marvy everything. She read slowly. Arvid had spent those 2 years doing something she had known nothing about. He had been writing letters, and making phone calls to a man named Stafford Oaks in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He had been sending soil samples, from the farm, through the mail, using a neighbor to help him with the driving, when he could not manage it himself. He had been reading everything he could find about herbal agriculture, and soil restoration, and the market for dried medicinal plants in New England. And he had been building, page by careful page, a plan. The notebook listed everything. 11 companies that source dried red clover and other herbs from small farms in the region. Specific varieties of red clover suited to Vermont's climate. Notes on harvest timing, drying methods, and what buyers looked for in terms of quality. And in a section near the back, a detailed summary of what the whole property would need before any of this could work, written in Arvid's measured and precise way, as if he were leaving instructions for someone who would come along after him. Which, of course, he was. Marvy sat on that milk crate in the cold barn for a long time. When she finally turned to the last page of the notebook, she found one more thing. A single line in blue ink that had faded slightly, but was still entirely readable. It said Stafford Oaks, Portsmouth. Call him when you are ready. He is waiting. She folded the notebook closed and held it in both hands for a while. She thought about the years Arvid had spent getting up before dawn and working until dark and never once complaining about the land even when the yields were bad and the bills were tight. She thought about how little she had understood, in those years, about what he was actually paying attention to. She thought about him lying in that hospital bed in the final months, writing letters and sending soil samples, and building something he would never get to see finished. She did not cry that evening. She carried the notebook into the house, put it on the kitchen table, and made herself a cup of tea. Then she sat and read the whole thing again, from the beginning. She was not ready to call Stafford Oaks yet. But she knew she was not going to sell the farm. Spring came early that year, which in Vermont meant the mud arrived before anyone was prepared for it. Marvy made her decision in late March, standing at the edge of the upper field, with her boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. She was not going to plant corn. That was the first thing. She was not going to rent the fields out to anyone, with heavy equipment, and a plan to push the ground hard for another season. The news traveled fast. In a county town the size of Millhaven, a farmer changing crops, without explanation, was enough to keep the conversation going for weeks. By the time Marvy placed her seed order, the talk had already started at the co-op on Main Street, which was the kind of place where agricultural decisions got weighed as seriously as local politics. Merritt Pruitt was there the morning someone mentioned what Marvy was planting. Merritt owned the largest farm, within 10 miles of Millhaven, a well-run and efficient operation, with clean equipment lines, and soil that, whatever its actual condition, produced reliably year after year because Merritt knew how to push it. He was 62 years old, and had the kind of confidence that comes from decades of being right often enough that the times you were wrong tended to get forgotten. When he heard that Marilla Holt had ordered red clover seed instead of corn, he set down his coffee cup and shook his head slowly. Not angry. Almost sorry. As if someone had just told him that a careful plan had already gone wrong at its foundation. He said loud enough for everyone in the store to hear it, "Flowers do not pay property taxes." The men standing nearby laughed, because it had the ring of a thing that was obviously true. Marvy heard about it by lunchtime. She did not call Merritt. She did not drive to the co-op to explain herself. She went out to the field, knelt down, and pushed her fingers into the earth. The soil resisted immediately. She pushed harder, and her fingertips barely made it past the first joint before the ground stopped her. It felt dense and closed, like something that had forgotten how to move. She stayed crouched there for a moment, pressing her palm flat against the surface, and feeling how little it gave. Then she stood up, went back to the house, and got out the soil sampling bags. She took 16 samples over the course of 3 days. Not one sample for the whole property. 16 separate ones from 16 different locations, each bag carefully labeled, with the slope, the drainage, the most recent crop history, and what she observed when she dug. Some of the soil crumbled when she pulled it up. Some came out in heavy, compacted slabs. Some had an odd sour smell that she wrote down and circled. Some had almost no smell at all, which in its own way was a kind of warning. When the results came back from the lab, she spread them across the kitchen table and opened Arvid's notebook beside them. She went through each report slowly, checking them against the notes Arvid had written during those 2 years she had known nothing about. He had predicted the problems correctly in 12 of the 16 sample sites. Low organic matter, uneven pH, soil biology that had been starved by years of heavy use, some areas short on specific minerals, others not lacking nutrients, so much as lacking the structure that would allow plants to reach what was there. She sat with that for a long time. The man had done this from a hospital bed. He had sent strangers out to dig on his own farm, while he was lying there trying to hold on, and he had gotten 12 out of 16 right. But there was something the results showed that was not in the notebook. The section in the northeast corner of the property, the part that had been dismissed for years, as unusable because the yields there had been worst of all, had a particular mineral composition that the lab noted as uncommon for the Addison County region. The report described it as especially well suited to certain types of medicinal herb cultivation. Red clover was on the list. Marvi read that section 3 times. She wondered if Arvid had known. She decided it did not matter either way. He had pointed her toward the right crop and the right path. Whether he had known exactly why the northeast corner would respond the way it would was a question she could not answer, and did not need to. She ordered lime for the fields that needed pH adjustment. She arranged for compost where she could afford it. She planned her seeding schedule carefully, section by section, according to what each part of the property actually needed rather than what was simplest to manage across the whole farm at once. 2 weeks before she was going to put the first seed in the ground, she had a visitor. Noli Pruitt came on a Tuesday morning, which was when Noli usually ran her errands in town. She arrived with a basket of homemade bread, which was the kind of thing Noli always brought, when she was carrying a conversation she had not written herself. Noli was Merritt's wife, and had been for 34 years. She was also, through a complicated piece of county history that Marvi had never fully tracked, distantly related to Arvid's family on his mother's side, which meant she showed up at the farm occasionally, and considered it a kind of standing obligation. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Noli talked about her sister in Burlington, and the weather, and the price of propane. Then she reached into her coat pocket and put a white envelope on the table between them. Inside was a letter from Merritt. An offer to purchase the back 40 acres of the Holt property at what the letter described as fair market value, with the transaction to close within 60 days. Cash payment. No contingencies. Marvi read it twice. Then she looked up at Noli, who was looking at her bread basket, with the expression of someone who had been given her lines ahead of time, and was not entirely comfortable with them. Marvi said, "Noli, Arvid spent 2 years thinking about what to do with this property. 2 years of his life, when he already knew he was sick. I am not going to sign anything until I understand what he figured out." Noli nodded slowly, not quite meeting her eyes. She finished her coffee. She took the letter back. She drove away, without pressing the matter further, and she called Merritt before she reached the end of the road. That afternoon, Marvi's phone rang. It was Quimby Creel, the branch manager at First Addison Bank, where the Holt farm carried an equipment loan that Arvid had taken out several years before he got sick. Quimby had a smooth, careful voice that always sounded reasonable no matter what it was actually saying. He said there were some questions about the loan file that he would like to go over in person. Nothing urgent. Just a review. Could she come in sometime this week? It was the kind of call that had nothing threatening in it on its own. But Marvi had grown up in a county town, and she knew what it meant when the bank called 2 days after a neighbor made an offer on your land, and you turned it down. She told Quimby she would think about a time to come in. Then she hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands still on the receiver. She had been putting off the last page of Arvid's notebook since the night she found it. Not because she was afraid of what was there. She just had not felt ready. But standing in her kitchen in the particular silence that follows a phone call that was not quite a threat and not quite a warning, she finally pulled the notebook off the shelf. She read the last page again. Stafford Oaks. Portsmouth. Call him when you are ready. He is waiting. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Arvid had written down. It rang 7 times. She counted them. Then a man's voice answered. It was an old voice, unhurried and a little rough at the edges, the kind of voice that came from years of talking outdoors. He said his name and waited. Marvy said, Mr. Oaks, my name is Marilla Holt. I am Arvid's wife. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not the pause of someone who did not recognize the name. The other kind. The pause of someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen, and was now, after a long time, watching it happen. Then Stafford Oaks said, I have been wondering when you would call. Arvid told me it might take a year. I have been waiting 2.5. Marvy sat down slowly in the kitchen chair. Outside the window, the field was still bare, still closed, still holding everything in. But something in the way that old man said those words, patient and certain, and without any surprise at all, made her feel for the first time, since she found that notebook, that she was not moving towards something unknown. She was moving towards something Arvid had already seen. Stafford Oaks arrived on a Thursday morning in early May, without warning, in a truck that had seen more mud than pavement, and looked comfortable with that fact. Marvy was in the side field checking the moisture of a section she had limed 2 weeks earlier, when she heard the engine come down Quarry Mill Road, and slow at her gate. She straightened up, and watched the truck pull into the drive. She did not recognize it. The man who got out was tall, but slightly stooped, the way tall men sometimes get in their 70s, when years of bending toward things lower than they expected has worked its way permanently into the spine. He wore a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the plaid had softened into something closer to a suggestion. His hands, when he reached into the truck bed, were the hands of someone who had spent decades doing work that left marks. He lifted out a bundle of rolled papers and a cardboard box, and then, carefully, a second box made of old metal, the kind with a hinged lid, and a small latch that had been replaced more than once. He looked across the field, and saw Marvy watching him. He raised one hand in a simple greeting and waited. She walked over slowly, pulling her gloves off, as she came. When she got close enough to see his face clearly, something about the steadiness in his expression told her she did not need to introduce herself. He said, You look like someone who has been working this ground for a while. She said, 3 years of trying? He said, Arvid told me you would say something like that. He also told me you were the one who would actually get it done. She had known his name for 2.5 years. She had read Arvid's notes about him dozens of times. But standing in her own driveway, with the smell of turned earth still on her hands, and this old man looking at her, with the quiet certainty of someone delivering something long overdue, she felt the full weight of what Arvid had set in motion, from a hospital bed in the last months of his life. She said, You drove all the way from Portsmouth? He said, Arvid asked me to come when you called. I figured waiting for an invitation after that was probably the wrong approach. They went inside. Stafford laid the rolled papers across the kitchen table, and Marvy recognized immediately that they were the analysis reports he had prepared for Arvid based on the soil samples Arvid had sent him. 6 reports, each one detailed and precise, with handwritten notes in the margins that did not match Arvid's handwriting. Stafford's notes. Responses to what Arvid had sent him. A correspondence in the margins of laboratory data. She stood there reading the margin notes, while Stafford poured himself a glass of water from the tap, without being invited, which was the kind of thing a person does when they feel they have already been in a place enough times in their imagination that the physical version does not feel entirely unfamiliar. He said, Your husband was meticulous. Most people who send me samples write 2 lines about what they want to know. Arvid wrote paragraphs. He wanted to understand the land, not just fix it. Marvy said, That sounds right. Stafford set down his glass and looked at her directly. He said, He also asked me to hold on to something for you. 2 things, actually. But one of them he was very specific about the timing. He reached for the metal box and opened the latch. Inside, packed carefully in cloth, were 6 small sealed bags of soil, each one labeled in red marker, with a number and a location code. And under the bags, a white envelope, sealed, with Marvy's name written on the outside in Arvid's handwriting. Stafford said these are the last samples he took, before he passed. He managed them himself, he told me, though I gathered he needed help getting out to some parts of the field. He never mailed them. I think he ran out of time. And the letter, he said to give it to you, when you called me? He said you would know, when you were ready? Marvy picked up the envelope. She looked at her name in Arvid's writing for a long moment. Then she folded it carefully, and put it in the front pocket of her work shirt, close against her chest. Stafford watched but did not comment. He picked up his water glass again, and looked out the kitchen window toward the field. He said, "Do you want to show me what you have been doing out there?" They spent 2 hours walking the property. Stafford moved carefully, but covered ground steadily, the way someone moves, when they have learned not to rush assessments. He knelt in several places, without being asked, and pressed his palm flat against the surface of the soil, feeling rather than measuring. In the northeast corner, the section the soil report had flagged for its unusual mineral composition, he stayed crouched for a long time, lifting a small handful, and letting it fall, through his fingers slowly. He said, Arvid knew this corner was different. He mentioned it in one of his letters. He said the ground there smelled different after rain. Marvy said, I noticed that too. I just did not know what it meant. Stafford said, it means the biology is closer to the surface here than anywhere else on this property. Whatever was done to the rest of the field, this corner held on to something. That is where the clover will do its best work. He stood and brushed the soil from his hands. He did not give her a speech about what red clover would do for the ground. She had read enough by then to understand the plant's role in fixing nitrogen, protecting the soil surface, and building organic matter, as its roots broke down, through the seasons. What she needed from Stafford was not explanation. It was confirmation, from someone who had stood on enough ground to know the difference between a field that could be saved and one that was too far gone. He confirmed it. He said, plant the northeast corner first, and plant it thick. Give that section 2 full seasons, before you touch anything in it. The rest of the field will follow, but it will follow slower. You need patience in front, and income behind it. They have to run at the same time. That was the part nobody had told her yet. Not just how to restore the land, but how to make it pay, while the restoration was happening. It was the exact problem she had been turning over in her mind since winter, and the fact that Stafford had named it, without being asked, told her Arvid had explained the situation clearly in those letters. She was still thinking about that when she heard the truck slow on the road. Merritt Pruitt's vehicle was recognizable at a distance. He drove a dark green pickup that was newer than anything else on Quarry Mill Road, and kept cleaner than the road conditions really warranted. When Marvy looked up and saw it moving past the fence at half speed, she knew he had spotted the unfamiliar truck in her driveway, and was deciding what to make of it. He rolled down his window. He called across the fence in the tone of someone making conversation rather than asking a question. What are you doing out there, Marvy? Planting more flowers? Stafford had been crouching a few feet away, examining the clover seedlings that had begun to come in on the middle slope. He stood up slowly, without hurrying, and turned to look at the truck. There was nothing confrontational in the way he moved. Just a man getting to his feet, and taking in what was in front of him. Stafford said, not planting. Evaluating. Merritt looked at him for a moment, sizing up the flannel shirt, and the worn boots, and the age. He said, you a buyer? Stafford said, no. I am a friend of her husband. Merritt's expression shifted slightly. He said, Arvid has been gone 3 years. Stafford looked at him steadily, and said, his work has not. Nobody said anything for a moment. The field moved in a light wind. Marvy watched Merritt's face, and saw the things she had learned to recognize in him, the brief recalibration that happened when a situation did not arrange itself the way he had anticipated. He was not a stupid man. He was a man accustomed to having the clearest picture of any room he walked into, and Stafford Oaks was a variable he had not accounted for. Merritt nodded once and drove on. He was on the phone before he reached the end of the road. That evening, Marvy made supper for the two of them, and they sat at the kitchen table, while the light went out of the day. Stafford talked about the 8 years since he had left the university, and the way he talked about it told her more than the words themselves did. He was not bitter exactly, but there was a particular kind of tiredness in how he described the department meetings, and the budget reviews, and the slow elimination of the applied plant science program he had spent 15 years building. He had watched people younger than him, with more politically useful research agendas absorb the funding and the attention, while his work on soil health and medicinal herb cultivation got reclassified as niche and eventually defunded entirely. He had moved to Portsmouth and bought a small piece of land and started growing things. He had written articles for agricultural journals that had small readerships. He had consulted for a handful of farmers who found him through those articles or through word of mouth. And he had exchanged letters and phone calls with a Vermont farmer named Arvid Holt, who had read one of those articles in a waiting room somewhere, and written him a 4-page letter about a piece of ground in Addison County. Stafford said, "Most people who write to me want a quick answer." Arvid wanted to understand. He asked me questions I had to think about before I could answer them. "That is rare," Marvy said. "He was always like that." Stafford said, "I know. He told me about you the same way. He said you were the one who noticed things. He said he was the talker, and you were the one who actually saw." She looked down at her coffee. Outside, the field was dark and quiet. She thought about Arvid watching her from across a kitchen table for 30 years, and making notes about her in his head the same way he made notes about everything else. The thought made her chest tighten in a way that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but somewhere between the two. The next morning, Stafford drove back to Portsmouth. He left behind the soil reports and a handwritten list of the 11 buyers Arvid had identified, with Stafford's own annotations added beside several of the names based on what he knew of their current purchasing priorities. He told Marvy to call him when the clover came in thick enough to assess the first cutting. He told her not to rush the northeast corner no matter what the rest of the field was doing. He had been gone 4 days when the second call from the bank arrived. Quimby Creel did not bother with pleasantries this time. He said the board of First Addison had reviewed the Holt loan file and had concerns about the current use of the secured property. He used the phrase "not consistent" with conventional agricultural standards, which was a careful construction that managed to sound procedural, while meaning something specific. He said the board would need to discuss the possibility of a formal property revaluation, and that Marvy should come in at her earliest convenience. She asked him directly, "Is this related to an offer that was made on my land recently?" Quimby paused. He said, "The board reviews loan files on a regular basis, Mrs. Holt. This is a standard process." She said, "I will bring my attorney." There was another pause, shorter this time. Quimby said that was entirely her right. She called her attorney that afternoon. His name was Gerald Foss, and he had handled the Holt family's legal matters for 20 years, including the original farm purchase documents, from when Arvid's parents had transferred the property. Gerald was methodical and unhurried and the kind of lawyer who believed that the most important paperwork was always the paperwork, from 30 years ago, that nobody thought to check. She told him about the call. He asked her to come in the next morning and bring everything she had on the loan and the property title. When she arrived at his office, he was already at his desk, with the original purchase file open in front of him. He had found something the night before. Arvid, when he had arranged the transfer of the property from his parents' estate years earlier, had added a handwritten clause to the deed agreement, 1 page, separately notarized, attached to the back of the main document. It specified that no outstanding loan instrument secured against the Holt farm property could be used as the basis for a forced transfer of ownership or title while the primary borrower remained current on all scheduled payments. Gerald looked at her, over the top of the document, and said, "He filed this in 1987. Your husband filed this in 1987. Marvy sat very still. She said he knew. He knew something like this might happen someday, and he filed that clause 37 years ago. Gerald said, "I cannot say what he was thinking in 1987. What I can say is that you have not missed a single payment, and this clause is fully enforceable. Quinby Creel and his board can call whatever meeting they want. They cannot move against this property, as long as you stay current, and they know it, as soon as I put this document in front of them." They went to the bank together the following afternoon. Quinby had 2 people, from the board in the room, with him and a lawyer Marvy did not recognize. Gerald placed a copy of the 1987 clause on the table, and let everyone read it without commentary. The room was quiet for long enough that the sound of traffic on Main Street became noticeable. Quinby said, "We will need to review this with our legal team." Gerald said, "Take all the time you need." Marvy sat across the table from Quinby Creel and did not look away from him. She was thinking about Arvid in 1987, young and healthy, and not yet sick, sitting in a lawyer's office, and filing a clause that he might never need, protecting a piece of ground he had not even owned for very long yet. She was thinking about all the things Arvid had done quietly, without telling her, that she was still finding out about years after he was gone. The meeting ended without a formal decision. Gerald told her on the sidewalk outside that it was effectively over. They had nothing to stand on. The first cutting of red clover came in late July of the second year, and it was not everything Marvy had hoped for. The northeast corner performed the way Stafford had predicted, thick and even, the blossoms coming in deep reddish purple, and holding their color well into the afternoon heat. But the middle section was still uneven. There were patches where the clover had taken hold confidently, and patches where it was thin and struggling against the persistent weeds that had established themselves in the years before. She harvested the good sections by hand, working in the early morning, before the heat of the day, cutting the flower heads at the stage Stafford had told her to look for. She spread the first batch to dry on the salvaged racks in the old milk room, with the fans running, and the side door open to catch the cross breeze. She checked it 3 days later. The color was holding. The smell was clean. She checked it again on the 5th day, and knew before she fully opened the first bag that something was wrong. The stems in the lower sections of the rack had not dried evenly. The moisture had moved up from the cut ends and settled in the flower heads overnight, and what she was smelling now was not the clean herbal sharpness she had expected, but something heavier and turned. She lost nearly half the batch. She carried the ruined bags out to the compost pile herself in 3 trips, working in the gray of early morning, so the neighbors driving past on the road would not see. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not move for a long time. This was the moment she would describe later, when people asked about the hardest part, as the one time she seriously wondered whether Arvid had been wrong about her. Not about the land. She had enough faith in the soil tests, and in Stafford's assessment to believe the land could come back. What she wondered, sitting in the kitchen in the quiet of a failed morning, was whether she was the right person to do it. Arvid had written that she was the one who noticed things, the one who saw. But she had not seen this problem in time to prevent it. She had lost weeks of work, and whatever goodwill a first successful delivery might have built, with a potential buyer. She sat there for a long time, without calling anyone. Then she made herself think through exactly what had gone wrong, step by step, without letting herself soften any of it. The racks had been too close together. The fans had not been pushing air through the lower levels effectively. She had harvested one section too late in the day, when the stems still held field moisture. She had not separated the heavier stem material from the lighter flower heads before drying. for specific mistakes, each one correctable. She called Stafford the next morning. He listened without interrupting, while she described what had happened. When she finished, he said, "The racks? The spacing between layers is the problem 9 times out of 10 on a first batch. Tell me what you have." She described the setup. He told her exactly what she needed to change. He said he had a second set of drying frames at his place in Portsmouth that he had not used since he consolidated his operation the previous year, and that if she could use them, she was welcome to come get them. She drove to Portsmouth that weekend and loaded them into her truck. Stafford helped her carry them down from the barn loft, without being asked, and without making anything of it. On the drive back, she thought about what it meant that this man, who had every reason to be finished with the kind of careful, unrewarded work that institutions had spent years telling him was not worth their time, was spending his Saturday morning carrying equipment down from a barn loft for a woman he had met once in person. She thought about Arvid choosing him out of a waiting room article, writing him a 4-page letter, and building a 2-year correspondence based on nothing but the quality of the thinking on both sides. She got back to the farm in the late afternoon and set up the new frames that same evening. She reconfigured the fan placement and marked the positions with tape so she would not have to remember it next time. She wrote down every change she made and why. The next cutting, 3 weeks later, came out right. The northeast corner yielded flower heads that held their color through the full drying period, and came out of the bags with the clean, slightly sweet smell that Stafford had described as what buyers in the herbal market were looking for. She weighed the first successful batch on the kitchen scale. She photographed it. She wrote down the harvest date, the field section, the cutting time, and the drying conditions on a label that she attached to each bag. Then she sat down at the table with Arvid's list of 11 buyers and began writing letters. Not emails. Letters on paper, with the name of the farm at the top. She described the property, the soil restoration process, the approach to harvesting and drying, and the fact that she was working with an advisor who had spent decades in applied plant science. She did not oversell. She did not claim to be larger than she was. She wrote each letter as if she were explaining the situation to someone she respected and did not need to impress. The woman from Burlington called first. She ran a small herbal tea operation that sold at farmers' markets and through 3 specialty grocery stores in the region. She asked a series of careful questions about growing practices, and was particularly interested in whether any herbicides had been used on the property in the past 5 years. Marvy answered everything directly, including the years when the farm had been under conventional management, before her decision to shift methods. The woman said, "I appreciate that you told me that without me having to ask twice." They arranged for a sample order. 3 weeks later, a man from an organic dairy operation 2 counties north called about hay. He had heard about the clover from someone who had driven past the field and mentioned it. He was not looking for the herbal market product. He was looking for clean forage for a herd he was trying to transition to fully organic certification. The clover hay from the Holt farm, he said, would count toward that certification if the growing records supported it. Marvy sent him records going back to the first season. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early October, the call came that was different from the others. A man named Quillen Marsh identified himself as a senior procurement representative for a natural products company based in Massachusetts. He said he had received her letter and had a number of questions. The questions were detailed and specific and came in a sequence that told her he had done his own research before calling. He asked about field history, drying equipment, storage conditions, and batch documentation. Then he said he noticed that she had mentioned an advisor named Stafford Oaks. He said, "Stafford Oaks from UNH?" Marvy said the same. Quillen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Marvy had not expected. He had sat in one of Stafford's lectures during a regional agriculture conference 15 years ago, and had followed his published work afterward, even after the university parted ways with him. If Stafford Oaks was standing behind what was happening at the Holt farm, Quillen said, that was more assurance than any certification document could provide. He wanted to come see it in person. He came the following Tuesday in a truck that was clean and new and clearly not accustomed to gravel drives. He wore boots that had seen some use, but not much mud. He spent 2 hours on the property, asking questions the entire time, and he looked at Marvy's batch records with the focused attention of someone who understood what careful documentation actually cost in time and effort. At the end of the visit, standing by his truck, with the afternoon light coming at a low angle across the field, he said, "I will tell you something, Mrs. Holt. I visit farms all over New England. Most of them tell me what they think I want to hear. You told me about the batch you lost in July." Marvy said, "That seemed like relevant information." He said, "It is. And the fact that you said it the way you said it tells me more about how you run this operation than the batch records do." He drove away without making a formal offer. But he left her his direct number, and told her he would be in touch within 2 weeks. Garland Pruitt saw the truck on his way past. He was traveling the other direction, coming back from somewhere in the north, and he saw it turning out of her driveway, onto Quarry Mill Road. He would have recognized the company logo on the side. Most people in agricultural supply networks in Vermont would have recognized it. Merritt Pruitt saw the truck, as well, from the edge of his own northern field. He stood and watched it for a moment, then went inside and called Quimby Creel. Quimby called Marvy that evening. His voice had lost the careful reasonableness it usually carried. He said the board had completed its review, and had determined that a formal revaluation of the secured property was required under the terms of the original loan agreement, specifically the clause related to material changes in land use. He said the board was prepared to invoke a provision requiring full settlement of the outstanding balance within 60 days, if the revaluation showed a reduction in collateral value. Marvy said, "I have a copy of the 1987 clause in front of me right now, Quimby." Quimby said, "We are aware of that document. Our legal team has reviewed it." She said, "Then your legal team has told you the same thing mine has. Send me the formal notice in writing. I will respond through my attorney." She hung up, and sat in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went outside, and walked to the edge of the northeast field. The last of the October light was moving across the clover that had not yet been cut for the season, the blossoms darker now in the cooling weather, but still holding, still standing. Bees were still working it, fewer than in August, but present, doing what they did, without regard for what was happening in a bank office 12 miles away. She stood there, until it was too dark to see clearly. Then she went inside, and wrote down everything Quimby had said, word for word, from memory. Before she slept that night, she thought about something Mercer Alland, the youngest member of the County Agricultural Council, had told her at the hardware store 2 weeks earlier. He had pulled her aside quietly between the paint aisle and the seed display, and said that Geraldine Foss, the council chair, had received a pledge of financial support for her upcoming re-election effort from Merritt Pruitt, and that the pledge had been made in the same week that Marvy received her first administrative inquiry from the council. Mercer had not elaborated. He did not need to. Marvy understood what he was telling her, and why he had chosen to tell her rather than stay quiet. 48 hours after Quimby's call, Quillen Marsh called back. He did not wait 2 weeks. He said his company wanted to offer a 3-year supply agreement for dried red clover blossoms, with volume targets, that would require her to manage the full northeast section as primary production ground, and potentially bring additional acreage into the program over time. The price per pound was higher than she had allowed herself to expect. She said, "I need to read the contract before I commit to anything." He said, "Of course. I will send it today." She said, "One thing before you do. I need you to understand that I will not promise volume I cannot deliver, and I will not deliver product I am not confident in. If a batch is not right, I will tell you before it ships. Not after." He said, "That is exactly why I am offering you this contract, Mrs. Holt." She read the contract at the kitchen table, that night with Stafford on the phone, going through it section by section. Stafford asked the questions she would not have thought to ask about termination clauses, and quality dispute procedures, and what constituted acceptable cause for volume adjustment. By midnight they had worked through all of it. She signed it the next morning. And then she drove to First Addison Bank, with a cashier's check for the full remaining balance of the equipment loan, walked into Quinby Creel's office, without an appointment, and set it on his desk, without sitting down. Quinby looked at the check. He looked at her. He looked at the check again. Whatever he had expected, from the past several months of pressure and procedural maneuvering, it was not this. Not her walking in on a Wednesday morning, and paying the thing off entirely, before his formal revaluation notice had even been drafted. She said, "I would like a receipt, please." He wrote one out by hand, and gave it to her. She folded it into her coat pocket, and walked out. On the drive home, she passed Quarry Mill Road, and turned in at her own gate. She sat in the truck for a moment, before getting out, looking at the field. The northeast corner was still standing in the morning light, the last clover of the season holding on in the way that plants hold on, when the ground beneath them is beginning, slowly and without fanfare, to remember how to support them. She got out of the truck, and went inside to call Stafford. The receipt from First Addison Bank was a small piece of paper, handwritten on Quinby Creel's official stationery, and Marvy kept it in the front pocket of her work coat for 2 weeks, before she moved it somewhere safer. Not because she needed to look at it. She knew what it said. She kept it there, because the weight of it, light as it was, reminded her every morning, when she reached for her gloves, that the thing Merritt Pruitt and Quinby Creel had spent months trying to take from her was still hers. Gerald Foss called 3 days after she paid off the loan to tell her that First Addison's legal team had formally withdrawn the revaluation request. He said it in the tone of a man who had expected this outcome, but had learned, over many years, not to assume. She thanked him, and asked what she owed for his time. He told her. She wrote the check that afternoon. Stafford called the same evening. He had heard from Quillen Marsh, who had apparently spoken with him directly to confirm the terms of the supply agreement, before finalizing it. Stafford said Quillen had asked him a single question: was the Holt operation the kind of thing that would still be running the same way in 5 years? Stafford said he had told Quillen that in his professional opinion it was the kind of operation that would be running better in 5 years, because the person running it got more precise every time something went wrong. Marvy listened to this, without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "You did not have to tell him that." Stafford said, "I told him what I believed. That is the only kind of reference worth giving." She said goodnight, and hung up, and stood in the kitchen in the quiet that follows a conversation that meant more than either party said out loud. It was Nolly Pruitt who called first the following Saturday morning, when Marvy was working in the barn, and almost did not hear the phone. Nolly's voice was different from the last time. The previous version of Nolly on the phone had been careful, and a little rehearsed, the voice of a woman delivering a message she had agreed to carry. This version was quieter, and more direct, and it had the particular quality of someone who had decided to say something, without consulting anyone else first. She said, "Marvy, I owe you an apology. I came to your house, with that envelope, knowing what was in it. I told myself I was just passing something along, but I knew what Merritt was trying to do, and I did it anyway." "That was wrong." Marvy said, "I know why you did it, Nolly." Nolly said, "I am not sure you do. Not the whole of it." She paused, and when she continued her voice had changed again, lower and more careful. She said, "Merritt's equipment loan at First Addison is twice the size of yours was. He has been behind on 2 quarterly reviews, and the board has been giving him extensions, because of who he is in this county. But the extensions are running out. He needed more land, as collateral, to buy himself another year. He thought your 40 acres would do it. When you did not sell, and then paid off your loan entirely, it left him with nothing to put in front of the board." Marvy said, I did not know that. Noli said, he does not want anyone to know it. But I thought you should. Because he is going to have to deal with it eventually, and the way he deals with things when he is scared is to go after whoever is nearest. I wanted you to be prepared. After she hung up, Marvy sat with what Noli had told her, and turned it over slowly. She thought about Merritt standing in that co-op on Main Street, and saying flowers do not pay property taxes, while the men around him laughed. She thought about him calling Quimby Creel every time something changed at her farm. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about what Noli had said. He was not acting from contempt. He was acting from fear. She understood that distinction more than she wanted to admit, because she had felt something close to it herself, sitting at the kitchen table the morning she lost half her first batch, wondering whether she had the capacity to do what Arvid had believed she could do. The difference was what you did with it. She drove to the Pruitt farm on a Wednesday afternoon. She did not call ahead. She pulled into the long gravel drive, and parked near the barn, and walked to the front door and knocked. Merritt answered. He was in work clothes, and had clearly come in from the field recently. He looked at her, without saying anything for a moment, which was not his usual manner. Merritt Pruitt almost always had something to say immediately. The fact that he did not told her Noli had mentioned the phone call. She said, I am not here to talk about the bank, or the letter or any of it. I came to ask if you want me to look at your ground. He said, What do you mean? She said, Noli told me you have a drainage problem on the lower section. She said you have known about it for 5 years. I am not going to pretend I know your land the way you do, but I have spent 3 years learning some things about what soil shows when it is under stress, and if you want a second set of eyes I will come out and walk it with you. He looked at her for a long time. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the house, she could hear the sound of a television, and then the sound of it being turned down. He said, Why would you do that? She said, Because Arvid would have. And because your land is your land, and what happens to it matters regardless of what has happened between us. He did not say anything for another long moment. Then he stepped back from the door and said, Give me 10 minutes. They walked his lower field in the late afternoon, Merritt talking and Marvy mostly listening. He showed her where the water pooled after heavy rain and stayed too long. He showed her the section where the grass came in pale even after he put down fertilizer. He pointed out where the runoff from the upper slope came down in a concentrated line during storms and hit the lower ground with enough force to seal the surface. She asked him when he had last taken soil samples from the affected area. He admitted he had not done it in 4 years. She asked whether he had ever sampled the pooling section specifically. He said no, he had always sampled across the field, as a whole. She said, That is where I would start. The pooling section is telling you something different from the rest of the field. You need to know what it is saying before you can decide what to do about it. He nodded slowly, looking out across the low ground. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, I drove past your place the morning after you paid off the loan. I saw your field. I sat there on the road longer than I should have. She waited. He said, It looks different than it did 2 years ago. The whole character of it is different. And I know enough about ground to know that kind of difference does not happen by accident. She said, It did not happen fast either. He said, No. I can see that. They stood there in his field for another few minutes without talking. The light was going golden and flat across the low ground. A flock of starlings moved through the air above them in a shape that kept changing, and then settled into the treeline at the far edge of the property. He said, I could use the name of a lab for the samples. She said, I will write it down for you before I leave. She left the Pruitt farm as the last light was going off the fields, and drove home on the back road with the windows down. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, something closer to the satisfaction of a thing having arrived at its proper shape, after a long time of being forced into the wrong one. The Addison County Agricultural Council held its annual meeting in the first week of November at the Grange Hall in Virgins. It was a standing event, usually attended by 60 or 70 people from across the county, and the agenda was the standard mix of budget reviews, committee reports, and the occasional policy discussion about land use or water rights. This year, Mercer Alland had added an item. He had submitted the request 3 weeks earlier, and had listed it simply as a discussion of soil health outcomes in small farm operations, with a case presentation from a local producer. Geraldine Foss, the council chair, had objected during the planning call on the grounds that the agenda was already full, but 2 other council members had supported the item, and it had stayed. Marvy had not expected to be asked. Mercer called her a month before the meeting, explained what he had in mind, and asked if she would be willing to speak. She said she would think about it. She called Stafford that evening and described the invitation. Stafford said, "What is making you hesitate?" She said, "I do not think of myself as someone with a success story to present. I think of myself as someone who is still in the middle of figuring things out." Stafford said, "That is exactly why you should go. The people in that room do not need to hear from someone who has finished. They need to hear from someone who is still doing it." She went. The hall was nearly full when she arrived. She recognized most of the faces. Farmers she had known for years, some of whom had been polite to her through the difficult seasons, and some of whom had not. Council members she knew by name, if not always by disposition. Geraldine Foss at the front table, with her reading glasses and her printed agenda. And in the third row, sitting with his coat folded over his lap, Merritt Pruitt. She had not known he would be there. He attended these meetings sometimes, and sometimes did not. She saw him before he saw her, and she watched him for a moment, without his knowledge, this man who had spent 2 years trying to move her off her land, and who had stood in his own field 3 weeks ago, and asked her for the name of a soil lab. He was looking at the printed agenda in his hands. He was not talking to anyone around him, which for Merritt was unusual. When Mercer called her name, she walked to the front of the room, and stood behind the small podium. She had not prepared remarks. She had thought about what she wanted to say, but had decided against writing it down, because the kind of things she wanted to say did not belong on paper. She set Arvid's notebook on the podium in front of her. She talked for 20 minutes. She told them about the soil samples, and what they showed. She told them about the decision to plant red clover instead of corn, and what that decision had cost her in terms of community goodwill and banking relationships. She told them about the batch she had lost in July of the second year, describing the mistake precisely, and without softening it, because she believed that the useful part of a failure was in the details, and not in the general impression of having struggled. She told them about Stafford Oaks, about the years he had spent building a program that an institution had eventually decided was not worth keeping, and about the 8 years, since then during which he had continued doing the same work on a smaller scale for anyone who would listen. Then she opened the notebook to page 47 and read Arvid's notes aloud. Not all of them. The parts that described what he had seen in the land, and what he believed it could become. She read them in Arvid's voice, as well as she could, which was not the same as his actual voice, but was close enough that she could feel the room listening differently once she began. At the end she said, "I did not come here to tell anyone that what I did is what they should do. Every piece of ground is different. What I came here to say is that the land on that farm was not finished. It was exhausted, and there is a difference. My husband knew that difference. He spent 2 years of his life, while he was dying, working out a way for me to understand it, after he was gone. The least I could do was pay attention." She closed the notebook. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mercer started the applause, and it moved through the room in a wave that told her people had been leaning toward this, without knowing it. Geraldine Foss did not clap. But she did not say anything either, which Marvy understood as its own kind of concession from a woman who had accepted campaign support from the man sitting 3 rows back. After the meeting, a woman came up to her near the door. She introduced herself as Stafford Oaks from the Vermont Farmers Weekly. She said she had been covering agricultural issues in the region for 11 years, and had never heard a presentation quite like the one Marvy had just given. She asked if she would be willing to be interviewed for a feature. Marvy said, "I will talk to you on one condition. The story has to include Arvid, and it has to include Stafford Oaks. I am not interested in being the story. I am interested in the whole story being told." Stafford said, "That is a better story anyway." Stafford came back to the farm in early December, his last visit of the season. He brought the remaining files from Arvid's correspondence with him, the full archive, and they spent a morning going through it together at the kitchen table. There were things in those letters that Marvy had not known. A particular exchange stood out, one in which Arvid had described walking the northeast corner in the early morning, after heavy rain, and noticing that the ground there responded differently from the rest of the field. Stafford had written back a single confirmation. Arvid had answered, with one line in return, "Then that is where we start." Marvy read that exchange twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window. The field was brown and bare under the December sky, the season's last clover cut weeks ago, and the ground resting under a thin cover of frost. It looked like nothing in particular to someone driving past. But she knew what was underneath it now, what the soil had been doing through the growing season, and what it would do again in spring, with one more year of recovery behind it. Before Stafford left, he stood in the kitchen doorway, with his coat on, ready to go. He said, "I got 3 calls last month, from farmers who read about the Holt operation in a circular that Mercer Allen put out after the council meeting. One of them is a younger man down in Windham County, with a back field he does not know what to do with. I am going to go look at his ground next week." Marvy said, "That is good work, Stafford." He said, "It is the same work I have always done. It is just that now someone is pointing people toward it." He drove away in the early afternoon. She watched the truck go down Quarry Mill Road and disappear around the bend, and she thought about the particular kind of persistence it took to keep doing a thing well for 8 years, when the world had decided it was not interested in paying attention. She thought about Arvid choosing Stafford out of a waiting room article and writing him a 4-page letter. She thought about how the right things found each other sometimes, not through systems, or institutions or official channels, but through one person paying close enough attention to recognize something worth pursuing. The letter had been in her coat pocket since the day Stafford delivered the metal box. Through the bank meetings, and the council presentation, and the signing of the supply contract, and Merritt's field, and Nolly's phone call, and all the ordinary days of work between each of those things, she had carried it, without opening it. She had known, without being able to explain exactly how, that there was a right time for it, and that she had not reached it yet. She reached it on a Sunday evening in mid-December, when the farm was quiet, and the work of the week was done, and the kitchen was warm, from the wood stove she had finally gotten around to having cleaned and serviced in October. She made tea, and sat at the table, and put the envelope in front of her. Arvid's handwriting on the outside. Her name. The letters slightly uneven, the pressure inconsistent in the way that had become familiar in the last months of his life, when his hands had stopped fully cooperating. She opened it carefully. The letter was 4 pages, written on both sides of 2 sheets of paper. The handwriting was Arvid's, but effortful, each word placed, with deliberation, the lines not always straight. She read it slowly, taking her time with the parts that were harder to decipher, not wanting to miss anything. He wrote about the farm. He wrote about the years they had spent on it together, and the years before that when his family had worked the same ground. He wrote about the particular feeling of walking a field you knew well enough to read, the way the land communicated, through small signs, if you had trained yourself to notice them, the way it showed its history and the way it held water, and grew roots, and cracked in dry weather, and came back after rain. He wrote about what he had done with Stafford, and why he had not told her, while he was doing it. He said he had not wanted her to feel she was being handed a plan. He had wanted her to find it in her own time, and decide for herself whether it was something she wanted to do. He said he had been fairly sure she would want to do it. He had not wanted to take that decision away from her by presenting it as the obvious path. He wrote about the northeast corner, and the way it had always felt different underfoot, the particular give of the ground there compared to the rest of the field. He wrote that he believed that corner had been waiting for the right approach for a long time, and that he was sorry he was not going to be there to see what it became. Then, near the end of the third page, she found the section she had not known was there. Arvid had contacted a soil certification company in Montpelier the previous spring, months before he died. He had arranged the initial filing for organic certification of the Holt farm property. He had paid the filing fee, and the first year's administrative costs, from a small insurance policy she had not known about, one he had taken out years earlier, and kept current, without ever mentioning it, because he had wanted it to be available for exactly this kind of purpose. The certification process had been initiated. It was waiting to be completed. All she had to do was call the contact, whose name and number he had written at the bottom of the page. She sat with that for a long time. The organic certification would change what she could charge for the clover. It would change how she could represent the product to buyers like Quillen, and to the smaller regional accounts she was building. It would change the story she could tell about the farm, because the story of an organically certified operation that had been restored from conventional use was a story with significant value in the market she was entering. Arvid had known all of that. He had filed the paperwork, and paid the first costs, and left her the contact information, and said nothing. She finished reading the letter to the last line. He had ended it simply, the way he ended most things he wrote, without decoration or excess. He wrote that he loved the farm, and that he loved her, and that in his experience those two things had always been the same love expressed in different directions. He wrote that he hoped she would stay, but that if she decided not to, he would understand, because the land did not belong to anyone's grief, only to whoever was willing to take care of it next. She folded the letter carefully, and put it back in the envelope. She sat in the kitchen for a long time, after that, not doing anything in particular, just present in the warmth of the wood stove, with the sound of the wind moving outside. She thought about Arvid. She thought about her father Olin, who had run those same fields in a different time, and whose patience with the land she had watched, as a girl, without fully understanding what she was seeing. She thought about Stafford driving down from Portsmouth with drying frames in his truck, because a man he had never met in person had recognized something in his published work worth 4 pages of careful thought. She called the number on the last page of Arvid's letter the following morning. The certification contact was a woman named Alvin, efficient and straightforward, who pulled up the Holt farm file immediately, when Marvy gave her name. She said the file had been sitting in active pending status since Arvid had initiated it. All the groundwork was there. The on-site inspection could be scheduled for early spring. If the farm met the standard, certification would be issued by summer. Marvy said, "We will meet the standard." Alvin said, "Based on what I am seeing in the file, I believe you." Spring came the way it always came in Vermont, mud first and then green, the fields softening, before they firmed up again, and the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes in the first warm weeks of March. Marvy seeded the northeast corner earlier than the previous 2 years, because the ground was ready for it, and she knew how to read that now, the particular texture and yield of soil that had recovered enough to receive seed, with the right intention. A young woman came to the farm on a Saturday in late April. Her family had a piece of ground 2 towns over, a back field, that had been sitting unproductive for 3 years, and that nobody in the family knew what to do with. She had read Selvine's article in the Vermont Farmers Weekly, the piece that had run in February, with a photograph of the northeast corner of the Holt field, and a shorter photograph of Stafford standing at the edge of it looking at something just out of frame. She had driven out on her own, without calling ahead, which Marvy recognized as a particular kind of earnestness. They walked the field together for an hour. Marvy showed her the drying setup in the old milk room, pulled out the batch records from the previous 2 seasons, and explained the mistakes as fully as the successes. The young woman listened carefully, writing things in a small notebook. At the end, she asked, "Do you think I should plant red clover?" Marvy looked across the farm before answering. The northeast corner was showing the first faint green of new growth along the low ridge line, where the seed had gone in earliest. The middle section still needed another season, before it would be at full capacity. The work was not finished. It would probably not be finished in any final sense for years yet. That was not the point of it. She said, "No? I think you should go home and take samples from that back field of yours, specific samples from the areas that concern you most, and send them to a lab and read what comes back. Then I think you should call me, and we will talk about what you have." The young woman nodded. She wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, "How did you know it would work? When you started, I mean. How did you know you were not just wasting your time?" Marvy thought about that for a moment. She thought about the notebook she had found on the barn shelf in November, and Arvid's notes in the margin of a soil report, and Stafford driving down from Portsmouth without being asked. She thought about paying off a loan, with money she had not expected to have, and standing on the sidewalk outside the bank on a Wednesday morning, with the receipt in her coat pocket. She said, "I did not know. I just knew the land was not finished, even when it looked like it was. And I knew someone, who had paid close attention to it, had believed the same thing." That was enough to start with. After the young woman left, Marvy walked the upper slope alone. The afternoon light was low, and moving, the kind of light that turns everything it touches slightly more itself than usual, more precisely what it is. The clover on the northeast section was coming in evenly, the rows clean, and the color deep, where the soil had had 3 years to come back to something like its original character. She knelt at the edge of the section, and pressed her palm flat against the ground. Then she pushed her fingers in, slowly, and the soil gave way around them, without resistance, past the first joint, past the second, until her hand was in the earth up to the middle knuckle, and the ground around her fingers felt loose, and alive and full of the particular smell that Arvid had described in his letter to Stafford as the thing that told him this corner was different. She stayed there for a moment, with her hand in the ground, and the light moving over the field, and the sound of the bees working the early blossoms somewhere to her left. She thought about Arvid writing those words from a hospital room, trying to describe a smell to a man he had never met, reaching for language to explain something that was easier to feel than to say. She understood it now. She had understood it for a while. But there was something about having her hand in the ground on a warm April afternoon, with 3 years of work behind her, and the certification letter arriving in 6 weeks, that made the understanding feel complete in a way it had not before. Not triumphant. Not the feeling of winning something. The feeling of having arrived at a place that had been waiting for her to find it. She pulled her hand out of the soil, and stood up slowly. She brushed the earth from her fingers, and looked out across the property toward Quarry Mill Road where, on the other side of the fence, the world was going about its business the way it always had. The field was not perfect. The middle section still had another season of recovery ahead of it. The south slope needed different attention than the northeast. The old milk room roof was going to need work before winter. The tractor was making a noise she did not like. Farming did not become simple, because the land came back. It became a different kind of work, one that required a different quality of attention, the kind that asks not what can I take from this but what does this need from me. Arvid had known that question. He had spent 2 years asking it, from a hospital bed, sending samples through the mail, building a correspondence with a retired professor in New Hampshire, filing organic certification paperwork, with an insurance policy he had kept quietly current for years. He had done all of that without telling her, because he had trusted her to find it in her own time, and make it her own. She had found it. She had made it her own. The bees were still working the early clover, when she walked back toward the house. The field moved in the late afternoon wind, the new growth bending and straightening in the particular rhythm of a thing that was rooted well enough to move without breaking. She stopped once near the gate and looked back at it. The whole of the northeast section, 3 seasons in the making, was catching the low light in a way that made it look less like a crop and more like an answer to a question that had taken a long time to ask correctly. She went inside and called Stafford. He answered on the second ring. She said, "The northeast section is coming in? You should come see it in June, when it is at full bloom." He said, "I was planning to." She said, "Arvid would have liked this spring." Stafford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He did like it, Marvy. He just liked it ahead of time." She held the phone, and did not say anything. Outside the kitchen window, the field was still catching the last of the afternoon light. The bees were still moving through it. The ground beneath them was doing what ground does, when it has been given back the conditions to remember what it was built for. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy, journey